The stories of monsters who come out at night in the woods are just that, stories. So why does Ellie suddenly feel like she's being watched? The Woods Are Lovely, written by JanePeden, narrated by Rodney V. Smith. Ellie glanced at her watch. I really should get going. It's late. The older woman smoothed back her short gray hair and smiled at her. I'm sorry I kept you so long, Eleanor. I do enjoy our visits. Ida gathered up their cups and set them in the sink while Ellie put the teapot back on the stove. Ida had been her grandmother's best friend and was the only one who called her by her full name. She'd been named for her grandmother, who cared for her and raised her after her mother died. She'd never known her father, but now that her grandmother had passed away, she had nothing left but the little cottage she'd grown up in, her job at the diner, and her dog, Toby. Ida had known her all her life, and that at least gave her a sense of family. I have the early shift tomorrow, Ellie said, frowning. It meant she'd be there when the doors opened at 5 a.m. Then you'd best take the path through the woods to get home faster, Ida recommended. Cutting through the woods would save her time, but it made her uneasy. I don't know, Ida. It'll be dark soon, and you know what people say about the woods at night. Nonsense, Ida said. The woods are lovely. A few minutes later, she had to decide. If she continued down the road, she'd be home in 45 minutes. Cutting through the woods would save at least half an hour. Toby would be wanting his dinner by now, and Ellie really wanted a good night's sleep. She took the path. The woods were always shadowed, except for occasional spots where breaking a canopy of foliage allowed the sun to shine through. Her mom had known all those spots and had taken Ellie into the woods for picnics when she was a little girl. That would have been on one of her mom's good days. On her bad days, she'd stayed in her room sleeping, while Ellie played quietly on the floor and wished her mom would wake up. People had always said there was something not right about Ellie's mom, and Ellie remembered one time where they'd been picnicking and her mom had just wandered off, leaving Ellie alone until her grandmother found her hours later. Ellie didn't remember being afraid, but after that her grandmother had kept a closer eye, and she'd heard them argue, her grandmother accusing, and her mom just brushing it off, as if there was nothing wrong with leaving a 3-year-old child alone in the woods. She'd always scoffed at the stories that there were monsters in the woods who came out at night, and so did Ellie. But Ellie thought there might be bears or wolves prowling at night, closer to town than they'd venture during daylight hours, and that was scary enough to make her go quickly through the path. The sooner she reached her cottage, the better. I really need to get my car fixed, Ellie thought as she moved farther into the woods, where the darkness seemed thicker and the trees on either side of the path grew closer together. Just a few more paychecks and she'd be able to. Then she could drive to the diner if she had an early shift or was working late that day. Ellie liked to walk, but... She stopped abruptly. Had someone just called her name? She stood still, straining her ears for the slightest sound. Aye? Aye? Ellie laughed and shook off her nerves. It was just a bird. She must really be on edge to have imagined it was a voice calling Ellie. That's what you get for staying too long at Ida's, she told herself. If you'd left an hour ago like you should have, you'd be tucked into bed now, reading a book with Toby curled at your feet. She continued walking, then heard a rustling nearby. The wind blowing through the branches. She stopped again, and the sound stopped too. Ellie felt icy fingers move across the back of her neck. It could be a bear or a wolf. Was it stalking her? Suddenly, taking the shortcut didn't seem like the best idea. The woods are lovely, the woods are lovely. She repeated Ida's words like a mantra. The woods had always been lovely to her. She'd returned to their tranquility many times during her childhood, even after her mother had died, having private picnics with her dolls, or leaning against a tree to draw on her sketch pad. She'd never understood why the other kids preferred the hot cement playground over the shady peace of the woods. She'd climbed its trees and brought nuts for its squirrels, seeds sometimes for the birds that made their home here. But the woods felt different at night. It was almost completely dark now, twilight fading into blackness, the trees taking on ominous shapes. There were no birds chirping now, no squirrels leaping from branch to branch. It was too quiet. Her friends' mothers had told them to stay out of the woods, but at least one other mom had allowed her child to play there. A boy about her age, who she'd caught watching her a few times, his face familiar enough that she sketched his picture on her pad. But he must have been shy, or maybe he wasn't allowed there after all, and was worried she'd tell, because when she'd called out to him, he turned around and disappeared back into the woods. When she'd showed the sketch to her grandmother and asked who he was, her grandmother said she didn't know everyone in town, but maybe he was from the new housing development a few miles away. Ellie had forgotten about him until now. It had been years since she'd been a child playing in the woods. She started working part-time at the diner when she was 16, then full-time when she graduated high school. Most of her friends had moved to bigger cities or gone off to college. Ellie hadn't decided what she wanted to do with her life. Even with her grandmother gone, something held her here, and she couldn't bring herself to sell the cottage and leave. Ellie would celebrate her 3-year anniversary at the diner in a few weeks, along with her 19th birthday. Then, maybe, she'd think about the future. She heard a rustling again, closer it seemed, and picked up her pace. She was beginning to see, even in the dim light, that the trees were thinning ahead. That meant she was almost home. Some of the tension eased out of her body. Then, a twig snapped behind her, and she was certain that wasn't the wind. She spun around to confront whatever was behind her, and her eyes widened as she tripped over an exposed root and fell backward. Her head hit something solid, and everything went black. Ellie opened her eyes slowly. She moved to sit up, then pain shot through her head, and the room started to spin. She laid back down. She was on a couch, but where? Hey, don't try to sit up right away. You really whacked the back of your head when you fell. She reached her hand around, felt the tender lump, and winced, then looked up at the face staring down at her, and blinked her eyes a few times. The face was blurry, but she could see thick, wavy brown hair falling over his forehead, and blue eyes that seemed to show concern. Here, he handed her an ice pack. This might help. She hesitated a moment, then took the ice pack and held it gingerly against her head. Who are you? Where am I? My name's Dylan. You're in my cabin. She tried to bring her eyes into focus. You look familiar. He shrugged. You might have seen me around. You live in the blue cottage with the white trellis on Cedar Lane, right? At the edge of the woods. How do you know where I live? Like I said, I've seen you around. It struck her suddenly that she was alone in a cabin with a man she didn't know, and she wasn't sure how she'd gotten there. She leaned further back on the couch as she felt a little shiver along her spine that had nothing to do with the bump on her head. How did I end up here? It had all happened so fast. She remembered having the feeling that someone was watching her. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig behind her, and then she turned and saw... Saw what? Something. But she couldn't remember. Were you following me? He looked sheepish. Hey, I'm not some crazy stalker dude. I saw you in a path and wanted to make sure you made it home okay. Why wouldn't I? Well, you did fall and hit your head. Only because someone snuck up on me. It was you, wasn't it? I got spooked because I thought it was a bear. She tried to remember. What had she seen when she turned around? Something large, moving quickly. Not him. Some kind of animal? No bears in these woods. They stay closer to the mountains. Then what did I see? It was probably just me. He put a hand on her arm, lightly. Get some rest. I'll take you home in the morning. In the morning? What time is it? It's after midnight. I have to go now. I have to feed my dog, Toby. There's no one else there. She pushed back the thin blanket he'd placed over her and tried to sit up. She still felt a little dizzy and her head throbbed, but at least the room wasn't spinning this time. "Relax," he said. "I got your dog for you." Dylan moved, so he was no longer blocking her view. Toby was lying on a rug in front of the fireplace, sleeping. She squinted. "Oh God, I'm having double vision." There were two Tobys on the rug, just inches apart. Dylan laughed. "No, that's Gus. He and Toby were littermates." She went still. "How could you know that?" She'd had Toby for almost a year now. A few weeks after her grandmother died, she'd come home from her shift at the diner and found him in the basket on her back porch. No note or anything, just there, curled up in a small blanket, sound asleep. "I was trying to give him a good home," Dylan admitted. "Wait, I know why you look so familiar. You're that little boy, aren't you?" "What little boy?" "The one who used to watch me playing in the woods, but would never come out when I called to him." He shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't supposed to." "You weren't supposed to what? Play with me? Or watch me?" "Either," he said, and smiled. There was something about his face, his presence, that made her think he meant her no harm, but she was still uneasy. He knew about her, and she knew nothing about him. "How did you get into my cottage to get Toby?" "Like most people around here, you left the spare key under your doormat. No one worries much about intruders." It was true. It was a small town and people were friendly. Crime was pretty rare. Still, he'd gone into her house uninvited. "Maybe they should," Ellie said, and Dylan laughed. "Come on, aren't you glad I went back for Toby?" "Went back? Wait a minute. Why did you bring me here? Why didn't you just take me home? We were close to the cottage." Her earlier suspicions were creeping back in again. He shook his head, and some of that unruly hair fell across his forehead. "I couldn't take care of you there." "Why not?" But instead of answering, he stood up. "I have to go do some things." She gazed up at him. "In the middle of the night?" He reached down and picked her up off the couch. "What are you—" "Relax. You'll be more comfortable in the bed." It was an odd feeling, having him lift her, carry her as if she weighed nothing. Of course, he must have carried her a lot further than across the room to bring her to his cabin. Dylan unfolded a comforter that was folded neatly at the foot of the bed and pulled it over her. "Stay here. I'm locking the door. Don't open it, do you understand me?" "Why not? What's out there?" "Not bears," he said, as if he'd read her mind. "It's just some of us aren't as friendly to outsiders." "Some of who?" "Those of us who live off-grid out here." She frowned. "So all those stories about monsters roaming the woods at night are just people living off-grid? Like you?" "Yeah, like me," he said, then added, "It keeps people from getting into our business." He looked back before sliding the large door shut. "Go to sleep. You need rest. I'll be back soon." Since she was hardly in any condition to go stumbling through the woods in the dark, it appeared she didn't have much choice. Ellie woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and sounds of birds calling. Toby and Gus were curled up at the foot of the bed. She sat up, relieved that the pain and dizziness were gone. There was no sign of Dylan. Since the cabin was just one large room with a bathroom off to the side, there wasn't any place he could hide. Ellie glanced at her watch. Oh, crap. She'd slept past 8 o'clock. Her shift at the diner started 3 hours ago. She fumbled through the bedding and found her cell phone. Although she'd never had much luck getting a signal in the woods, it was worth a try. There were messages. The first from her boss around 5:15, asking how soon she'd get there. Another, more annoyed, a little later. Then a final one about 20 minutes ago, saying he was worried and was going to send someone to check on her once the breakfast rush slowed. In 3 years, she'd never been late for a shift. She was surprised the phone hadn't wakened her. Then she remembered she'd never taken it off silent when she left work yesterday. Ellie was surprised she had service. Ike's gruff voice answered. "Are you all right, girl? What the hell?" "I'm sorry. I fell last night and hit my head, and I overslept this morning." His voice was immediately filled with concern. "You need to go to the hospital? You want me to come over?" No, I'm fine. I'll be in tomorrow. Okay, but you let me know if you need some time off. You'll get your shifts covered. You have to be careful with head injuries. After she hung up, she looked around the cabin. Despite the rustic walls and the open beam ceiling, the place was pretty modern, with area rugs defining the separate living spaces. She went into the bathroom and washed her face, then used her finger to rub toothpaste on her teeth. They must not be far from town if he had indoor plumbing. But no, she remembered he talked about living off-grid. She'd heard of people managing with a generator and a water tank, but had never seen it before. The appliances were updated, and even the front door was one of those trendy barn door designs she'd seen on home improvement shows when she did some DIY projects at the cottage. There was a sleek laptop on the desk, and she lifted the lid curiously. No password. Maybe you didn't need to worry about IT security when you lived off-grid. There was a document open that looked like some kind of engineering paper for a college. She shut the lid, afraid of leaving evidence she'd been snooping. Surely it was safe to go outside now. Maybe she could find her way back. She grabbed the handle on the wide door, then pulled. The door didn't move. She tugged harder and felt resistance. Dylan had locked the door from the outside. Why would he lock her in the cabin and leave in the middle of the night? She took a deep breath. Her phone was working. She could call 911. She could call Ike to get help. Then a sinking realization came over her. She had no idea where she was. Suddenly, she felt the door sliding open, and she jumped back, startled. Toby woke up and started barking, while Gus ran to the door, tail wagging. Dylan stepped in. You're awake. Why did you lock the door from the outside? He studied her. Well, I couldn't lock it from the inside. She looked at him skeptically and took another step back. You're not a prisoner here, Ellie, he said evenly. Then take me home. He nodded. Of course. Over the next 2 weeks, her encounter with Dylan seemed to be less weird and herself more paranoid. On the long walk back to her cottage, she'd even thought he was leading her around in circles to confuse her, but that was ridiculous. The cabin was just pretty remote. Dylan had explained that he didn't build it, but it had been much less modern when he moved in. The original owner had moved farther into the mountains to a more secluded area, and Dylan was living there in exchange for making improvements. He told her he was 21 and in his last year in the Penn State online engineering program. Since his age matched with him being the boy she remembered, and the off-grid plumbing and other conveniences didn't seem odd for a guy who was studying engineering. She was already feeling foolish about her suspicions by the time they were back on a familiar path through the woods. His explanation that he'd had no alternative but to lock the cabin from the outside made sense once she was on her way home and no longer feeling trapped. You know, he'd said, even if you don't want to leave here, you could still get the degree online. Ellie had shrugged, but it had got her thinking. She didn't want to leave, not yet anyway, but she couldn't see herself spending the rest of her life working at the diner. He'd stopped at the end of the path, declining her invitation to come to the cottage and have a glass of iced tea before starting the long walk back. Toby ran ahead of her, leaping onto the small back porch. When she caught up and turned to wave goodbye, Dylan and Gus had already disappeared back into the woods. She'd taken a little teasing from Ike and the other servers at the diner when she told them about the hot young man who had come to her assistance, especially the part about how he'd taken her back to his cabin and watched over her to make sure she didn't have a concussion. Whereabouts was this? Ike had asked, and Ellie had confessed she wasn't sure. There's probably more people than we know about living off-grid out there, Ike commented. They have to come into town sometimes for supplies, so maybe you run into them. Just give him a call. Bonnie, the server who had covered for Ellie when she missed her shift, was a hopeless romantic, despite 3 marriages that all ended in divorce. Everybody has a cell phone, right? Then Ellie had confessed that she hadn't thought to ask for his number. Bonnie shook her head in disgust. You young people. When she told Ida, the older woman had listened and just nodded her head. Her only comment was that clearly this chance meeting with Dylan was meant to be. Ida was big on meant to be. She had crystals throughout her home and enjoyed using her tarot cards to predict Ellie's future. Ellie didn't believe, but she played along to make Ida happy and enjoyed the tea she drank in Ida's kitchen, enough to let Ida read her tea leaves when she visited. So when Ida seemed uncharacteristically upset from time to time for something she read in the tea leaves or the cards, Ellie just patted her hand and agreed to be careful. When Ida told her she saw a handsome young man in the cards, Ellie laughed and said maybe it was Dylan. Yes, Ida had responded thoughtfully. Maybe it was. All in all, things were back to normal, except for the dreams. She'd been having a recurring nightmare, one she'd had as a child, but hadn't returned in many years, until now. Her nightmare was filled with monsters too terrifying to look at, and in it, she was running through the dark woods, consumed by some kind of terror. She used to wake up screaming to find her mother holding her, rocking her gently. After her mother died, the nightmares went away, almost as if her subconscious had known that without her mother's gentle hands to pull her free, the nightmares might consume her. She imagined the return of the nightmares was just her subconscious way of dealing with her lingering confusion about what had frightened her in the woods in the first place, before Dylan had found her. Dylan. Her dreams about Dylan were anything but nightmares, but they were equally unrelenting. In her dream, she was back on his couch, and he was leaning over her again, not to check on her concussion, but to kiss her. She stared at his face, his soft lips curved in a smile, eyes cobalt blue with the depth of a painting by Monet. But each time, right before their lips met, she woke up. Images of his face haunted her beyond her dreams, so much so that when she had a day off, she decided to take a picnic into the woods, just like she'd done as a child, and sitting with her back against the trunk of a tree, she drew his face. Then she flipped to a fresh sheet of drawing paper and sketched a cabin, adding Gus sitting right outside it. She drew a portrait of Gus as well, although that was cheating really, since her model, Toby, was lying right there in front of her in a patch of sunlight. Ellie glanced at the picnic lunch she hadn't unpacked yet. She'd been so absorbed in her drawing. It was mid-afternoon, a long time before the sun would go down. She had the sudden impulse to try to find Dylan's cabin. She could thank him for taking care of her, share her picnic with him, and show him the drawings. If he was interested, she'd give him one. He might not be excited about his own portrait, but she'd bet he'd want the one of his cabin and the one of his dog. And this time, she'd be sure to get his number. Ellie stared at a fork in the paths. She was hopelessly lost. She was sure she and Toby had passed this point at least once before, more than an hour ago. Why hadn't she paid closer attention when Dylan had walked them from his cabin to the part of the woods that was familiar to her? She was so sure she was heading in the right direction. She looked nervously at her watch. She was not about to get caught in the woods again after dark. She'd just go a little farther and then give up and head home, if she could even find her way home. It was no use, and it was turning to dusk, the sun's rays already low in the sky. This had been a fool's errand. "Come on, Toby," she said, but Toby took off in another direction, forcing her to run after him. "Toby, come back!" Her well-trained dog ignored her. Then she saw why. She stepped through a clump of vines and into a clearing. It was the cabin, and there was Dylan standing outside with Gus beside him. Toby ran toward them, barking cheerfully. She saw Dylan scoop down to greet him, heard him say, "Toby, how did you—" Then his voice was cut off by a thunderous roar from the side of the clearing, and a monster emerged right out of her nightmares and headed straight toward Dylan, rearing up, its sharp fangs snapping as it made those terrifying sounds. It would tear him to pieces. He would never make it back into the cabin in time. "No!" she heard herself scream, and Dylan turned, looking right at her, his mouth gaping in surprise. Even the monster halted for a second. Then it refocused its attack on Dylan and moved toward him, seeming even more enraged. Ellie screamed again, and with no thought of herself, raced toward the monster, even as she heard her own voice turn into an inhuman howl, even as her body felt like it was exploding from the inside out. She hurled herself at the monster, filled with rage. There were monsters in the woods. She knew it now. She would protect Dylan, even if it meant her life. Her rage flew out of her and consumed her as her hands raked like claws over something that yielded. She heard Dylan's voice shout, "Ellie, no, stop!" Then she heard nothing at all. She woke up on Dylan's couch with a strange sense of déjà vu. Her entire body ached, and she felt disoriented. In the background, she could hear two voices arguing quietly but intense, like their control clinged by a thread. "I told you to stay away from her," was a man's voice, one she didn't recognize. "And I did until now. It's not up to you anymore." Dylan. That was Dylan's voice. What were they talking about? And what happened to the monster? Had she actually chased it off? Was Dylan unhurt? "It damn sure is up to me," the man answered. "Her mother never wanted this for her." "Her mother's been dead for years," Dylan said. "It's her choice now, hers." The man gave a bitter laugh. "Not anymore. You can't undo what happened today." Ellie managed to open her eyes and sit up. Dylan sat in a chair facing the fireplace. The older man was pacing. "What's going on? What happened?" They both turned toward her. The man had deep scratches on the side of his face that looked fresh, and his upper arm was bandaged. "Ellie, let me introduce you to Jared. He's the man who built this cabin." Dylan paused. "He's your father." Her brain just wasn't computing. "My father? I don't have a father." "Eleanor," the man said, his voice going gentle. "You look so much like your mother." Was it possible? But if this was her father, why had he left her? She shook her head, tried to clear her thoughts, and looked back at Dylan. "But what happened to the monster that was attacking you, that I tried to fight?" Jared reached up and touched the side of his face lightly. "Oh, I'd say you succeeded." "You," she whispered. "You were the monster?" "She doesn't need to know anymore," Jared said to Dylan. "Just take her back to the cottage." "I need to know everything," Ellie said, and braced herself. "Damn it, Jared, you know I can't just take her back. She changed." He paused. "If you won't tell her, I will." When Jared didn't speak, Dylan sat down at the end of the couch, shifting Ellie's legs onto his lap. "Your father and I are the same." "You mean you both turn into monsters?" "No, Ellie. We are what you call monsters. We can take human form temporarily, but we can't hold it for extended periods, especially not at night, and not at all if we leave the woods." "Okay." She was trying to take it in. "So if my father is a monster, what does that make me?" Jared answered. "It makes you human, like your mother, with something inside you that was dormant, until he jerked his head toward Dylan, awakened it. When you attacked me, you changed. And I can never change back," she said dully. "Yes and no," Jared said. "You're only half of what we are, and half what your mother was. You could probably leave this place. It might never happen again." "It's no accident that I'm still here," Ellie said, "when all my friends moved on." She looked into the eyes of the father she had never known, and then the boy she was already falling in love with. "The woods are lovely," she said. "Why would I ever leave?" The end. JanePeden writes sexy contemporary romances set in the exciting South Florida city of Miami and thrillers in exotic locales. Law, lies, and love affairs in Wattpad page stories recently topped 2.9 million views. Her newest book, The Millionaire's Intriguing Offer, updates weekly. Check out Jane's other short stories on Wattpad. Jane says, "This is my first monster romance. I hope you enjoy it." So that's it for this installment of Monstrous Love, an anthology of short stories by Wattpad writers, brought to you by WritersConnX. There are 35 stories by some amazing writers, so make sure to subscribe if you want to know the instant a new story drops. We're publishing at least 2 new stories daily from February 1st to the 14th, so there's lots to check out. Don't forget to click the like button, and you can also leave us a comment to tell us what you think. For WritersConnX, I'm Rodney V. Smith, and I'll see you in the next one.